All right, picture this. It's the dead of night. You've just blown out the last sputtering rushlight, plunging your tiny, windowless hut into an inky blackness you can practically taste. Finally, you sink onto your straw mattress, the one you haven't changed since last Michaelmas. That's nearly a year, by the way. Within seconds, you feel them. Oh, you know what I'm talking about, don't you? A silent, unseen regiment of lice, marching with military precision from your pillow right into your hairline. Then come the fleas, springing from the wool blanket, landing with tiny, irritating thuds on your shins. And what's that? Something else, something wriggling under the coarse, scratchy linen tunic you've worn every single day for the past 3 months, perhaps even longer. You instinctively claw at your skin, a desperate, frantic gesture in the dark. But every scratch, every frantic rub only rips open yesterday's bite scabs, making them weep and sting. You know it's a losing battle. And tomorrow? Tomorrow you'll be up at the first hint of dawn, hungry, aching, and utterly exhausted, ready to plow the Lord's field. But here's the kicker, you'll still be deliciously, painfully alive to every single nibbling, biting, blood-sucking mouth on your body. Welcome, my friends, to the nightly routine of your average medieval peasant. It wasn't just a tough life, it was an unwinnable, lifelong cage match against parasites, a constant, intimate struggle that shaped their very existence. Forget those fluffy, pristine down nests you see in fairy tales. A medieval peasant's bed wasn't some cozy retreat. It was typically a crude wooden bench, a couple of rough-hewn boards, or if you were really lucky, a low cot. And what was it stuffed with? Not soft feathers, but rice straw or marsh reeds. Now here's the truly delightful part, that straw stayed put. Oh, it stayed put until it stank too much, which, as you might guess, could mean an entire year, sometimes even longer, without being changed. Can you even imagine? Think about what accumulated in that bedding. Day after day, night after night, it absorbed body heat, sweat, drool, and yes, the occasional accidental chamber pot spill. This concoction transformed your sleeping place into a humid, festering metropolis for every imaginable creepy crawly. We're talking fleas, lice, bedbugs, and the charmingly named mawworm. Modern archaeologists, bless their brave souls, have actually pulled samples of such ancient bedding stuffing. And what did they find? They counted up to 400 flea eggs per fistful. Just one fistful. Now seriously, try sleeping on that for a single night and staying sane, let alone for a lifetime. It was a sensory assault, a constant symphony of tiny legs skittering and tiny mouths biting. People weren't oblivious to their misery, of course. They knew it was awful, so they tried to fight back with what little knowledge and resources they had. They'd tuck what they called lousy bags, little herbal sachets filled with strong-smelling plants like wormwood and tansy, under their covers. The idea, noble in its intent, was to overwhelm these unwelcome guests with camphor-smelling vapors, hoping the pungent aroma would drive them away. But the reality, well, the herbs wilted and lost their potency in a matter of days. And the fleas, they simply relocated, finding the warmer, more secluded real estate between your toes or in the folds of your clothing far more appealing than a rapidly decaying herb sachet. It was a band-aid on a gaping wound. And who fared worst in this nightly battle? The children. Always the children. In many medieval poll tax records, you'll find entries like 6 children, 4 alive. While disease and famine played their part, chronic itch and the infections it brought were undeniably contributors to that grim attrition rate. A child, constantly scratching at scabies sores or infected insect bites, could easily contract a strep infection. Without modern medicine, that infection could quickly turn septic, and a child could be gone in a fortnight. Their parents, often half-numb from their own relentless infestations and the crushing weight of their daily toil, could do little more than mutter a desperate psalm and keep hoeing. The cycle of suffering was relentless, and for the youngest, often lethal. Let's talk wardrobe. For the average peasant, wardrobe was a generous term. Most owned 1, maybe 2, sets of clothes. This typically consisted of a linen undertunic, a wool overtunic, and if they were truly fortunate, some hose. A hood might complete the ensemble. Everything was sewn from coarse, irregular fabric, think rough, homespun wool or linen, often undyed. And this, my friends, was absolutely perfect for lice. Their tiny claws could hook into those uneven fibers with ease, transforming your clothes into a multi-story apartment complex for parasites. When did you wash this single outfit, you ask? Ah, that's a question for the ages. You washed the linen, perhaps, when the streams thawed in spring. Maybe at Easter, as a kind of ritual cleansing. But for the rest of the year, you didn't really wash it in the way we understand it. You simply shook the crust off, aired it by the fire, and perhaps gave it a good whack with a stick. That was about it. Body lice, those charming little creatures, have a particularly nasty habit. They glue their eggs, known as nits, directly to the fibers of your clothing. A single female louse can lay up to 10 eggs a day. Now, do the math. After 3 months of continuous wear, without proper washing, you'd have a shirt that was literally more egg than thread. It wasn't just dirty, it was a teeming, living ecosystem. The constant friction of the clothes against the skin, the warmth of the body, and the lack of sanitation created an ideal breeding ground for these relentless bloodsuckers. Imagine the incessant itching, the crawling sensation that never truly left you. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a constant, debilitating distraction from already arduous labor. Now it wasn't all grim. Villages did have a sort of communal effort, often called beating days. This was when the young men would take the family garments and vigorously whack them over bushes, trying to dislodge as many lice and nits as possible. Meanwhile, the girls, with keen eyes and nimble fingers, would pick lice off seams. It was a social occasion, even flirtatious perhaps, a rare moment of communal activity that wasn't backbreaking labor. But the victory, it was fleeting. It lasted maybe a day. Those tenacious eggs that survived would hatch. Your neighbors would invariably lend you a few of their own fleas, and the cycle, as predictable as the rising sun, would reboot. The sheer futility of these efforts, the constant struggle against an invisible enemy, must have been soul-crushing. It wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about a never-ending battle for a moment's peace from the incessant itch. A peasant cottage wasn't just a dwelling. It was a microcosm of their entire existence. We're talking about a single-room, thatch-roofed, wattle-and-daub hut. Small, dark, and often shared with more than just the immediate family. And here's where it gets truly cozy. During the harsh winter months, livestock often bunked inside with the family. A cow, some chickens, maybe a pig, all sharing the same precious warmth and space. On the one hand, this provided much-needed extra body heat, a vital commodity in freezing conditions. On the other hand, it meant extra parasites. Lots of extra parasites, fleas. Those industrious little jumpers aren't picky, they'll readily jump species. And while human lice are generally species-specific, other types of lice and mites can sometimes make the leap, or at least share the same environment. This constant intermingling of humans and animals in close quarters created a perfect storm for parasitic infestations. Imagine the smells, the sounds, and the sheer density of living things, all contributing to the microscopic menagerie that called your home its own. Archaeologists, again, have provided us with some truly cringeworthy insights. In Yorkshire, they've found 12th century floor sweepings. Yes, actual dust and debris from medieval floors that were a shocking 30% animal feces, 20% grain pests, and a staggering 50% arthropod parts. Translation: the floor didn't just feel gritty, it literally crunched underfoot with dried animal droppings, the exoskeletons of countless insects, and the remains of their own vermin. Every step was a reminder of the teeming life beneath you, a constant, unsettling presence. The smoke from the central hearth, which usually had no chimney and simply vented through the thatch, did offer a tiny bit of respite. Bugs, generally speaking, hate constant soot and smoke, so in theory it helped keep some of the crawlers at bay. But this small victory came at a massive cost. That same smoke coated lungs, stung eyes, and filled the air with acrid fumes. Chronic coughs, respiratory issues, and irritated eyes were simply part of daily life. At night, when you tried to find some peace, your options were limited. You'd curl up, pull your cloak over your head, and try to breathe through a sleeve that was already peppered with flea dirt. Sweet dreams, more like desperate dreams of an itch-free existence. The house wasn't just a shelter, it was another battleground in the endless war against the unseen. You might think that escaping the confines of the hut and heading outdoors for a day of labor would offer some relief from the constant onslaught of parasites. Nope, not a chance. The fields, far from being a sanctuary, presented their own unique set of challenges and horrors. Peasants toiled shoulder to shoulder, day in and day out, often sweat-soaked and weary. This intimate proximity, combined with shared headscarves and clothing, created ideal conditions for the effortless transfer of lice from one person to another. A quick brush against a neighbor, a shared tool, or even just the close quarters of communal labor meant that what one person had, everyone else soon would too. But the field-based horrors went far beyond surface-level lice. Consider the ubiquitous presence of manure. Peasant life revolved around agriculture, and that meant constant, direct contact with animal and human waste used to fertilize fields. This seemingly innocuous practice had devastating consequences. Manure handling meant regular, unavoidable contact with intestinal worm eggs. Modern coprolite studies, that's fancy talk for analyzing ancient feces, have revealed that infections from whipworm and roundworm topped a horrifying 70% in many medieval populations. Think about that, 7. Out of 10 people were likely harboring these internal parasites. How did these worms get in? Through contaminated food and water. Poor sanitation meant that human and animal waste often ended up in rivers, streams, and even the shallow wells that provided drinking water. Without understanding germ theory, boiling water wasn't a universal practice. So every sip of water, every bite of unwashed food, carried the potential for a new infestation. These intestinal worms weren't just a nuisance. They were insidious thieves, siphoning off precious nutrients from already meager diets. They caused chronic abdominal pain, diarrhea, weakness, and contributed significantly to the widespread malnutrition and stunted growth that plagued medieval communities. Imagine working all day in the fields, your body already depleted, while an army of worms inside you steals what little energy you have. And then there was typhus. This terrifying disease, spread by the feces of body lice, often flared up after harvest. Why then? Because that's when everyone gathered in barns in close, crowded conditions to thresh grain. The dust, the close contact, the increased louse load, it was a perfect recipe for an epidemic. One chronicler from the period chillingly notes a village losing 1/10 of their folk to the hot sickness that maketh spots like flea bites, but deadly. This was typhus, a feverish, debilitating, and often fatal disease that added another layer of dread to an already precarious existence. The fields, far from offering respite, were simply another arena where the peasants fought and often lost their battle for basic health. Now let's debunk a common myth, the idea that medieval people never bathed. That's not quite right. Peasants did wash, but it was a far cry from our modern understanding of personal hygiene. Washing was dictated by circumstance and opportunity. When streams thawed, they might brave the icy waters for a quick rinse. On feast days, it might be a communal activity, a rare chance for a more thorough scrub. If they lived near towns, some might even have access to public bath houses, though these were often more for socializing than for deep cleansing. But here's the rub, soap was a luxury. It wasn't the gentle, fragrant bars we know today. Medieval soap was typically made from harsh wood ash and animal fat, a crude concoction that often stung and irritated skin already cracked, inflamed, and raw from constant bites and scratches. So most peasants simply rinsed their hands and faces, a quick splash to remove the most visible grime. Full-body baths, maybe twice a year if they were lucky. The result of this infrequent and inadequate washing, layers upon layers of dead skin cells, sweat, grime, and yes, parasite frass, that's bug poop, for the uninitiated, compacted into a living, breathing crust on their bodies. This wasn't just unpleasant. It was a perfect environment for skin infections, fungal growth, and further irritation. Imagine the constant feeling of stickiness, the pervasive odor, and the never-ending itch beneath this biological armor. Combs, surprisingly, common tool in this battle. Double-sided combs, often made of bone or wood with incredibly fine teeth, have been found in low-status graves across Europe. These weren't for styling, they were for delousing. The fine teeth were designed to snap lice in half and dislodge nits. The act itself, the satisfying snap of a squashed louse, must have offered a fleeting moment of victory and psychological relief. But the actual physical relief, it lasted minutes, if that. New eggs would hatch, new lice would migrate, and the cycle would continue. Shaving the head was an effective solution for monks, who valued cleanliness and had no social stigma attached to a bald pate. But for a peasant girl, whose marriageability, and thus her economic security, often hung on her long, healthy hair, that wasn't an option. So they resorted to other home remedies. Vinegar rinses, nettle juice, even stale urine. Anything acidic was thought to loosen the glue that held nits to hair shafts. They might make the nits easier to comb out, but none of these concoctions actually killed them. So the ritual continued: comb, scratch, pray, and repeat, day after day, year after year. It was a desperate Sisyphean task against an enemy that simply refused to die. The very idea of true, lasting cleanliness was an alien concept. This is where the story gets truly grim. Parasites aren't just creepy, crawly annoyances. They are insidious disease vectors, silent carriers of death. Body lice, those tiny tenants of peasant clothing, were responsible for transmitting epidemic typhus, trench fever, and relapsing fever. These weren't mild illnesses. They were devastating, often fatal diseases that swept through communities, especially during times of stress, famine, or war. Typhus, in particular, caused high fevers, headaches, rashes, and delirium, and could wipe out entire families. Fleas, on the other hand, carried murine typhus and, most infamously, bubonic plague. While the Black Death was a catastrophic, singular event, the threat of plague was a constant undercurrent, always present in the fleas that infested homes, animals, and people. Medieval peasants experienced cyclical waves of these illnesses. Harvest fatigue, brought on by relentless labor and often poor nutrition, lowered immunity, making them more susceptible. Winter crowding in those small, shared huts dramatically increased the louse load, accelerating disease transmission. And then spring fevers would inevitably sweep through the weakened population, carrying off the most vulnerable. Contemporary sermons and superstitions often blamed these outbreaks on miasmas, bad air, or more commonly, God's wrath. But the real culprit, the true harbinger of death, was six-legged, blood-sucking, and absolutely everywhere. It was a silent, microscopic war waged on multiple fronts, and it wasn't just the external parasites. The internal ones, those intestinal worms we talked about earlier, were also doing their deadly work. But the biggest killers, perhaps, were dysentery and cholera. These waterborne diseases thrived because of one fundamental problem: waste disposal, or more accurately, the lack of it. Chamberpot contents were routinely flung into the lane. Directly outside homes, privies, if they existed at all, were often simple pits perilously close to wells. Groundwater, contaminated by this raw sewage, carried pathogens directly back to the very source of drinking water. Every bucket of water drawn from a well, every meal prepared with it, carried a deadly risk. Add to this the constant drain of nutrients from intestinal worms, siphoning off what little sustenance remained from already meager diets, and you begin to understand why the average life expectancy hovered around a chilling 30 years. The skin-crawling part wasn't just the incessant itching and the feeling of bugs on your skin. It was the slow, relentless drain of blood, nutrients, and vitality by thousands of tiny mouths, both inside and out. It was a constant, debilitating assault on the body, leading to a life that was often short, painful, and riddled with illness. Despite the overwhelming odds, peasants weren't entirely passive victims. They fought back with what little they had, employing a desperate, often ineffective, arsenal of folk remedies. Wood ash, for instance, was rubbed into clothing seams, believed to kill some of the larvae and eggs. While it might have had a minor abrasive effect, it was hardly a systemic solution. Smoke, often from burning aromatic plants like rosemary or juniper, was used to try and send bugs scurrying out of the hut. It might have temporarily cleared the air of some insects, but it also filled the small, enclosed space with dense, acrid smoke, coating lungs. And eyes offering a trade-off of one misery for another. Quicklime, a caustic substance, was sometimes sprinkled on floors. It was known to burn flea larvae, offering a temporary reduction in population. But it also blistered bare feet, adding another layer of pain and potential infection to their daily lives. Another curious method involved hanging shirts over anthills, hoping the ants would devour the lice, and sometimes they did. But often the garment itself would unravel or be damaged in the process, a precious and irreplaceable item sacrificed for a fleeting moment of delousing. Every single remedy was a crude trade-off between comfort, the time it took to implement, and their meager resources. There was no magic bullet, no easy solution. The wealthy, of course, had options. They could boil their bedding in large copper vats, hire laundresses to meticulously clean and press their clothes, or simply own multiple sets of spare linens, allowing for rotation and thorough cleaning. A peasant's single tunic, however, could never see boiling water. The coarse, homespun fabric would simply fall apart, leaving them with nothing. So the bugs won. Generation after generation, these tiny conquerors left their indelible mark. This wasn't just about discomfort, it was about chronic health issues. The constant blood loss from biting parasites contributed to widespread anemia. The constant drain of nutrients by intestinal worms and the frequent bouts of illness led to stunted growth and weakened immune systems. And the telltale, poxed complexion you sometimes see in manuscript margins. Those pitted, scarred faces were often the result of chronic infections, incessant scratching, and the lasting marks of a life lived in constant battle with microscopic enemies. It was a life of quiet, persistent suffering, etched onto their very bodies. Even in the dry, official language of medieval records, we find echoes of this daily struggle, brief glimpses into the lives of individuals. Court rolls from 1296, for example, record a complaint from one Alice of Henley. She was complaining her neighbor's cow doth stink and the fleas do bite. Alice, for her troubles, was fined a penny, a serious amount of money for a peasant, yet the offending cow and its accompanying fleas likely stayed right where they were. This small anecdote tells us so much. The close living conditions, the constant annoyance, and the utter powerlessness against these seemingly minor, but cumulatively crushing problems. Another fascinating piece of evidence comes from a 14th century medical tract, which suggests a rather poetic, if utterly ineffective, remedy. Taketh a dish of water and set under the bed, the fleas shall drown as they leap. Modern testers, with a touch of historical curiosity, have actually tried this. They placed bowls of water by infested mattresses. The average nightly catch, perhaps 3 fleas out of hundreds, maybe thousands. It was a testament to the desperate hope, however thin, that something, anything, might offer relief. It speaks to a deep human need to believe in a solution, even when faced with overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Even children's songs, those seemingly innocent rhymes, encoded warnings and acknowledgments of this pervasive enemy. Lousy, lousy, leave my head, find the monk instead, went one such ditty. Even in play, even in the nursery, the enemy had a name, a presence, and was part of their earliest understanding of the world. These snippets of life, these small details from centuries past, remind us that the struggle against parasites wasn't just a biological reality. It was a deeply ingrained, culturally acknowledged part of medieval peasant existence. It shaped their language, their folklore, and their daily routines in ways we can only begin to imagine. Stepping into a medieval manor house after experiencing a peasant's hut must have felt like landing on an entirely different planet. The contrast was stark, almost unbelievable. Stone hearths meant you could heat water regularly, a luxury beyond the wildest dreams of a peasant. Linen sheets, soft and clean, were boiled in massive copper vats, then pressed and aired. Servants, dedicated to the task, would meticulously delouse cloaks with hot pressing irons, the heat killing any unwelcome visitors. This wasn't just about comfort. It was about a fundamental difference in resources and the ability to control one's environment. Yet even nobles weren't entirely immune. Lice, those persistent little devils, didn't discriminate based on social class. We have records, like the one from King Henry VII's groom, who wrote of burning the king's shirts for the vermin. So even royalty had their struggle, but here's the crucial difference. They had the resources to fight back. They had multiple changes of clothing, servants to maintain them, and the means to clean their living spaces. When an infestation occurred, they could mitigate it, reduce its impact, and recover relatively quickly. Peasants, on the other hand, lacked these fundamental means. Their single tunic couldn't be boiled. Their straw bedding couldn't be regularly changed. Their small, crowded homes couldn't be thoroughly cleaned and aired. They simply had to endure the itch, the bites, the constant crawling sensation as inescapably as they endured the tithe to the Lord, the unpredictable weather that dictated their harvests, and the ravages of war. It was another layer of their subjugation, a biological one, that further highlighted the vast chasm between the lives of the privileged and the vast majority of the population. Their suffering was not just a consequence of their environment, it was a direct result of their social and economic position. Modern sensibilities, quite rightly, recoil at the thought of such an existence. It sounds utterly miserable, a life of relentless discomfort and disease. But here's the astonishing truth: medieval peasants adapted. They didn't just survive, they found ways to cope, to live, and even to thrive amidst the constant torment. Their resilience was truly unsung, a testament to the indomitable human spirit. They sang while scratching, finding communal solace in shared misery. They told tales by flickering firelight, transporting themselves, however briefly, beyond the confines of their infested huts. They brewed ale strong enough to numb the irritation, to blur the edges of their reality, and to offer a fleeting escape from the relentless itch. They found pride, a quiet, fierce communal pride, in simply outlasting yet one more brutal winter, one more season of creeping guests. Their bodies adapted too, in ways we can barely fathom today. Immune systems that for us might overreact to a speck of pollen or a harmless food allergen were for them tempered by constant, low-grade infection. Their bodies were in a perpetual state of readiness, constantly fighting off pathogens and parasites. This constant exposure, while debilitating, also built a certain kind of hardiness. They were tougher, more physically resilient than we, in our sanitized, medicated world, can possibly imagine. They were survivors, forged in a world designed, biologically, socially, and economically, to devour them. Their ability to endure, to find joy, to continue planting, harvesting, and raising families despite these overwhelming challenges is perhaps the most profound and humbling aspect of their story. So the next time you slide between fresh, clean sheets, perhaps after a hot shower, spare a thought for the medieval peasant. They never knew the simple luxury of a single unbitten, unscratched, uncrawled upon hour. Their entire life was a ceaseless, intimate negotiation with vermin, sharing blood, sharing beds, sharing breath. It was filthy, yes, and often tragic, but it was also profoundly, utterly human. They scratched, they endured, they loved their families, and they laughed, sometimes through swollen, irritated skin. Their world literally crawled with life, often unwelcome life. Yet they kept planting their seeds, harvesting their meager crops, and humming lullabies to children whose hair, under the candlelight, often glittered with the telltale gleam of nits. That, more than any grand castle or glittering crown, is the real Middle Ages, a nightly, lifelong war against the tiny conquerors who never, ever declared a ceasefire. It's a powerful reminder of how far we've come and how much we often take for granted. If you felt that phantom itch while reading this, imagine living it every single day. If you found this dive into history you can almost smell fascinating, then smash that subscribe button for more deep dives into the past. Drop a comment below telling us what other past horrors or forgotten aspects of history you want us to unpack next. And please share this with that friend who always swears they were born in the wrong era. Because trust me, after tonight's bedtime story, the the 21st century feels just fine, doesn't it?